I want to discuss two terms with you guys as you are beginning these readings from Native American writers. And those two terms are colonization and assimilation. So the definition of colonization is the action or process of settling among and establishing control over the indigenous people of an area, and or the action of appropriating a place or domain for one's own use. Now, this was happening in the U.S. during this time period that we are discussing right now. The United States had accelerated a set of policies and practices designed to eradicate Native American nations as distinct cultures and sovereign political entities. So you may have heard in your Alabama history or American history in high school about the Trail of Tears, where Native American tribes were pushed into the Southwest, Northwest, and Midwest. And what happened after that was that those particular lands, the government kept encroaching on more and more, and those spaces got smaller and smaller. And so one of the texts that I want you to read, you might have already read it, but if you haven't, please do. It's the piece by Nicholas Black Elk. And in his particular essay, he makes reference to what's called the Black Hills Treaty, and it's often or sometimes also referred to as the Fort Laramie Treaty. And what happened under this treaty was it was signed by the Lakota Sioux in 1868, and it guaranteed them ownership of the Black Hills of South Dakota in return for a reduction of their reservation lands. So in other words, they were making those reservation lands smaller with the promise of more land somewhere else. The treaty also stated that the government would provide rations for the Sioux, and these often, however, did not come. But when gold was discovered in the Black Hills in 1877, the government seized the area contrary to treaty provisions. And so this was a very typical occurrence. And that's why that Nicholas Black Elk calls this another treaty. And he goes on to say, our people did not want this treaty either, but 3 stars came and made the treaty just the same. And so the 3 stars there is actually Black Elk. He's referring to General George Crook there, who was sort of in charge of this whole negotiation. And so through his words and just a brief explanation of that treaty, you can see what was happening to these Native American people. The government was entering into treaties with them to take some land they were currently on and give them some land somewhere else, and also to provide for them, but those treaties were being broken. And Black Elk also talks about in that same essay that our people were pitiful and in despair, that they were hungry, that they did not have, that they were not getting what they were promised by the government. And so this was colonization at its dictionary definition. The United States government was trying to control the indigenous people of an area and take their land for its own use. And so there are many Native American texts that spoke out in resistance to colonization. Some are political, where tribal leaders would try to make political arguments as to why this colonization practice was wrong, appealing to the Declaration of Independence, saying that all people are created equal, and pointing out that Native Americans were not being treated that way. There were other types of resistance, including religious and spiritual movements. And so the ghost dance songs are poems or songs, actually, that you will have to read. And this was a movement throughout the Native American tribes. It started in one and sort of spread, in which they were participating in spiritual practices in hopes that things could be returned to the way that they were before white people came and colonized their areas. So pay attention to those songs as you read through them. And I'll go into more in depth in another video about the ghost dance songs and the massacre that resulted from them. The other term I want you guys to be familiar with is assimilation. And this just means, or is defined as the process by which a person or a group's language and or culture come to resemble those of another group. And this was also happening and is reflected in some of the texts that we will read. So what would happen as the Native Americans found themselves confined to the reservations, white missionaries would come in and encourage, sometimes strongly and forcibly encourage, the Native American children to attend boarding schools. And in these boarding schools, their Native American culture would be basically stripped from them, so that they would learn white European cultural practices, religious practices. And a good way of understanding this comes from the words of a man named Richard Henry Pratt. And Richard Henry Pratt was head of Pennsylvania's famous Carlisle Indian boarding school. And he believed that the purpose of those schools was to kill the Indian and save the man. And what Pratt meant by that was eradicate the Indian culture or the Native American culture. And then he believed in turn that would, quote unquote, save them. Because they saw white European culture, the government saw these Native Americans as less than, their cultures as not equal to. And so through these texts that we will read, I think you will get to understand the gravity of colonization and what it did to the Native American people, and then the equal gravity of the assimilation practices that followed in attempting to wipe out Native American culture.